Hello, marine biology students. In this video, we're going to talk about the ecosystem of the subtidal. So this week, we're going to learn about the subtidal, kelp forests, coral reefs, and the different categories of coral reefs along with their ecology. The subtidal zone is below low tide. We're going to talk mostly about the benthic communities right now, as the pelagic communities will wait for next week. The continental shelf is the submerged edge of a continental plate. Is the subtidal zone for the benthos. It extends from low tide to the shelf break, or the edge of the continental shelf. The slope of the continental shelf is normally more gradual than the shelf break, which is typically steeper. The slope of the shelf, the depth of the water at the shelf break, and the distance of the shelf break from shore varies greatly by location, narrower in active than in passive margins. The depth at the shelf break varies greatly, with an average of around 150 meters, or just less than 500 feet in depth. The continental shelf is biologically the richest part of the ocean, including a major portion of commercial fisheries. It is also an area of potential natural resources, such as oil and natural gas. For this reason, nations want to protect these resources from exploitation by other nations. In the 1950s, the United Nations agreed that each nation should have control over the marine resources out to 200 nautical miles off of their coasts. This includes the continental shelf and its resources. On the continental shelf, the temperature of the water varies much more than out in the deep sea, but less than we would see in an estuary or on rocky shores. The water is shallower than in the deep sea and is mixed by waves and currents. Warmer surface waters mix steadily with the rest of the water column, and that's because even though it seems quite deep to us, it is shallow enough that the current and the winds are able to mix the waters. Water turbulence from waves and surface currents keep the water column well mixed, with generally no stratification. This affects not only water temperature, but also the available nutrients as well. Nutrients never have a chance to sink to the bottom and become unavailable, as is the case in the deep sea, and so phytoplankton and other photosynthesizers often have access to resources that are lost in those deep sea environments. There are several sources for nutrients on the continental shelf. These include decaying organic matter, nutrients brought in from estuaries and terrestrial sources by way of rivers, and nutrients from detritus originating in other communities, such as seagrass meadows and kelp forests. Because of all of these inputs, water can also have decreased transparency. Due to suspended sediments. So there are 4 types of subtidal communities that we'll talk about on the continental shelf. These include soft-bottom subtidal, where the bottoms are made of mud or sand, Seagrass Meadows, hard-bottom subtidal, and kelp forests. In the soft-bottom subtidal, the three major categories of animals are the Epifauna, which live on the surface, the Infauna, which live within the sediments, and the Meiofauna, which are so small they actually live between the grains in the sediment. With the soft-bottom intertidal, there will be very few primary producers. And that's because there aren't a lot of attachment sites for those primary producers. There may be some benthic diatoms, however, on the sediments. Sessile, or non-modal species, will also be rare due to the lack of hard substrates. While there are more species present in this area than in the adjoining intertidal, the distribution is often patchy. And here we see a diagram of different types of distribution, from random to regular to patchy. A patchy distribution tells us that there are some physical or biological factors that will collect organisms together. Whether it's larval settlement or chemical cues, for some reason the organisms are going to group together. As I had mentioned, larval settlement plays a big role, and there can be chemical signals that tell a larva where it should undergo metamorphosis and become a member of the benthos. So the larva select particular bottom habitats to settle in. Several particular mechanisms are known, being abiotic, meaning physical and chemical factors, or biotic, meaning factors determined by other living organisms. On unvegetated soft-bottom communities, there will be many infauna. Being organisms that live within the sediments themselves. These can include polychaetes, mollusks, and others. And there will be some epifauna as well, such as sea stars, brittle stars, and as seen in this picture, a sea pen, which is a colonial cnidarian that's a filter feeder. There will also be some demersal, or bottom-dwelling, fish. Here we see a community of sand dollars living embedded within the sediment. These are relatives of urchins, and they position themselves at an angle in the sediment to filter feed the current using their tube feet. Here we see a collection of different bottom dwellers, like mollusks, echinoderms, polychaetes, crustaceans, and others. The Meiofauna are also a diverse group. The Meiofauna are organisms that live in the spaces between the sediment particles. Many of these species are unique and found nowhere else. On soft bottoms, there are many deposit feeders, meaning the food that is consumed by many of these organisms have already settled on the bottom, and it's by going through the sediments that they find their food. If we're looking at an environment that has a coarser substrate, such as sand instead of mud, then we'll find more of the feeders will be suspension feeders. Where they collect their food particles from the water itself. The difference between these two types of environments usually has to do with the amount of turbulence or water movement. Organisms that dig in the sediments are known as bioturbators. These are burrowing or digging animals that disturb bottom sediments. This helps to oxygenate the sediments, and these can include things such as polychaete worms, mollusks, certain fish, and even whales. A unique soft-bottom community that I would like to talk about are the soft-bottom oceanic communities near the poles, both North Pole and South Pole. These marine organisms face unique challenges. And also have unique diversity. One of the challenges of living in this environment is the formation of sea ice. The ice grows from the surface down, and it can reach all the way to the sediments, freezing and capturing marine organisms along the way. The sea ice can also move, which can actually scour the surface of sediments, removing and killing marine organisms that had been present. So there can be a large amount of disruption to the soft-bottom sediments in these marine areas. Not only sea ice, but also gray whales and walruses can function as bioturbators in these environments. And in this image, you can see the wall of sea ice, and you can also see marine organisms embedded within that wall. Many of these organisms move so slowly that they would not be able to escape the encroaching ice. In some of these soft-bottom communities, we get some of our few marine plants growing in dense mats called a seagrass meadow. So seagrasses are flowering plants, and there are over 50 different species of seagrasses. A seagrass meadow will usually develop in sheltered, shallow waters with good water clarity and mostly soft sediments. In tropical areas, the most common is turtle grass. From the genus Thalassia. And then, in temperate waters, eelgrass from the genus Zoestra. There is a high diversity of species associated with seagrasses. Including organisms that live on, around, and within the seagrass beds themselves. The density of the individual plants tends to be high, like you would assume with terrestrial grasses as well, and they generate a very high biomass. These seagrasses have high levels of primary production. And unlike seaweeds, they can actually get nutrients using their roots, often acquiring things that had otherwise been lost in the sediments. Some herbivores do feed on the leaves, such as turtles and sea urchins, but most biomass becomes available to consumers as detritus. Not only are the seagrass able to get nutrients from the sediments, they also help to stabilize the sediments. And stability is usually a rare commodity within the soft-bottom communities. When we look at the food web of these seagrass meadows, we see most of the primary production comes from the seagrasses, with some organisms feeding directly on them, but more of the organisms feeding off of the detritus. The carnivores feed on the primary consumers. There are many interactions at many levels of the food web in a seagrass meadow. If there is a lack of a primary or apex predator, that can cause other populations to grow. As those populations grow, their prey become limited, and that can in turn affect the levels below them. The change in the amount of predators can cause a drastic change in the ecosystem, and this is known as a trophic cascade. In this particular example, in the absence of sea otters, crabs develop. Those crabs feed on the organisms that typically feed on the epiphytes that grow on the seagrass. If there are fewer epiphyte grazers, the seagrass actually becomes encrusted with other organisms that can limit the seagrass's ability to photosynthesize and to be effective primary producers. With the introduction of the sea otters as a predator on the crabs, that means that there are more grazers to eat the things that are growing on top of the seagrasses, meaning the seagrass is healthier and able to produce more biomass. It's interesting how these keystone predators can balance so many different aspects of an ecosystem. And that completes this video. Now, before our next video, I would like you to think about, if you could live in the forest, what part of the forest would you live in? We'll talk about a different type of forest in our next video.